Let's have a look at our second question of our top 12 Russia questions. This question is a bit more challenging. It's what caused the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. So, just some background to begin with. The revolution started when the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky, pushed out the provisional government. The provisional government were put into power after the Tsar abdicated, and they were formed from the Duma largely, but they had to work alongside the Soviets. By October, the Bolsheviks had decided to take control, and they stormed the Winter Palace using their Red Army, which can be seen in a very glorified picture here, because it was actually very easy to take over the Winter Palace because the provisional government had already fled, realising that they just didn't have enough support. Remember, the leader of the provisional government, Kerensky, had gone around in a car on the morning of the revolution trying to garner or gather support and had failed to do so. So the Bolsheviks took power of Russia on the 25th of October 1917, after they had stormed the Winter Palace. So what caused the Bolshevik Revolution? Why did it happen? Now, a lot of the causes are similar to the causes of the February Revolution, which is useful to know. Let's start though with the timeline of what's happened since the Tsar abdicated, to make sure you know the chronology in which to put this question into. So the February Revolution led the Tsar to abdicate, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. Taking over was a provisional government, which because of Order Number 1 had to lead hand in hand with the Soviets in what was called a dual government. In April, Lenin returned from Switzerland, arriving at Finland train station, and he started to garner more support for the Bolsheviks through his Peace, Bread and Land speech and his April theses, which really put together his promises to the people. Now, the provisional government made a huge mistake in June because they launched a major offensive in a big push to try to win World War I. This offensive failed with 60,000 deaths, 200,000 casualties, and that caused mass disillusionment with the provisional government. So all the problems that the Tsar had faced in regards to World War I continued. There was food shortages, there was deserters, the railways couldn't cope with the demand. Now the level of discontent rose to such a degree that in July there was a spontaneous uprising of soldiers, of peasants, of workers who demanded that the provisional government leave. Now, Lenin and Trotsky didn't support this uprising in terms of they didn't want it to happen, but they felt they had no option but to go along with it. They knew it was too early to be successful, but they felt that if they didn't support, as in at least go along with the uprising, they would lose popularity with the people. So they did in what was called the July Days. The July Days uprising didn't work, and in fact Lenin had to go back into hiding after it. So then in August, Kornilov, who was a general, launched a revolt. This too failed. He wasn't like the Bolsheviks. He didn't believe in equality of the people. He believed the war could be won, but the provisional government weren't doing a good enough job with the war. So he wanted almost a military dictatorship in Russia. Now, the Bolsheviks were asked by the provisional government to help put down the Kornilov revolt. This was in some ways a mistake by the provisional government. So in the short term it worked. The Bolsheviks did put down the Kornilov revolt, but in the long term the provisional government had armed the Bolsheviks, which helped them in October storm the Winter Palace and take over Russia. So that's your chronology. I know it's a lot to take in, but just try to see it as the story, and it does make sense. It does flow when you see things and how they're interlinked. So what caused the Bolshevik Revolution of the 25th of October 1917? Well, the first major cause was the weakness of the provisional government. So the provisional government hadn't passed land reforms. Indeed, they had sent in soldiers to take back land that the peasants had illegally seized. So this made them very unpopular with the peasants. They did, though, pass some liberal reforms which backfired on them. So they allowed freedom of speech. Well, the Bolsheviks used that to publish their propaganda magazine, Pravda. They released political prisoners and allowed people to come back from exile, including Lenin. They abolished the Okhrana. So without these liberal reforms, the Bolsheviks wouldn't have had the freedom needed to generate the popularity they used to then launch the revolution. So this massively backfired on the provisional government. The provisional government also launched the June offensive, massive failure, 60,000 killed, 200,000 casualties. Men started deserting in huge numbers after the June offensive, and death squads were sent in to execute any deserters, making the provisional government look very unsympathetic and appear like the enemy of the people. And then, going back up here to the Kornilov Revolt, General Kornilov revolted, and the provisional government asked the Bolsheviks to help put the Kornilov Revolt down. In so doing, they armed the Bolsheviks, which was a big mistake because they used these arms to launch the October Revolution, and the Bolsheviks used this as a massive propaganda victory. They said they had saved Russia from a military dictatorship, and without them the provisional government would have failed to protect Russia. So the weaknesses of the provisional government are probably some of the biggest reasons for the October Revolution. Although, to be fair to them, some of the weaknesses weren't of their creation. So, for example, they inherited the problems with the war. But they could have chosen to surrender, but they didn't. They chose to carry on. So the next cause of the Bolshevik Revolution is hard to understand. Now, I'll try to put it in simple terms. Just remember, you'll only have to write a handful of sentences on this if it comes up. So what's more important is you have clarity than you have loads of detail. So the Soviets, they were the union of workers, and there was almost like a council of workers in each major city. So the biggest Soviets were the Petrograd Soviet and the Moscow Soviet. Now, the Soviets passed Order Number 1. This was a massive issue for the provisional government from the outset, because Order Number 1 massively compromised the provisional government's power. Because of Order Number 1, it was agreed that the army wouldn't follow any of the provisional government's instructions or orders without first having them checked and permission being given by the Soviets. So that established a situation of dual government which compromised the provisional government's power. Secondly, Trotsky was the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, and it was through the Petrograd Soviet that the revolution was actually organised and launched using the Petrograd Soviet Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC. Thirdly, and here comes a challenging one, on the 25th of October, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets met, and this was where representatives of each of the Soviets across the country came to one meeting, and that was called the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. Now, Trotsky very cannily presented the revolution as a fait accompli, i.e. the revolution had already started, what are you going to do about it? Now that massively displeased the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries at the All Congress of Russian Soviets. Now, you've got to remember, the Soviets were dominated by the Bolsheviks, but only in Petrograd and Moscow, and there were other parties who were represented in the Soviets. They didn't like the Bolsheviks just taking it upon themselves to launch this revolution. But what could they do about it? The revolution had already started, and Trotsky knew that. But what the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries did was walk out of the Congress. Now this massively diluted their power, because now they weren't even members of the Soviets. So that was a big mistake. Finally, what caused the Bolshevik Revolution of the 25th of October 1917 were the strengths of the Bolsheviks themselves. So let's look at the two key individuals. You had Lenin. Now Lenin promised peace, bread and land when he returned from exile in Switzerland. Now that massively appealed to the soldiers who liked the peace, the bread, the workers and the land, the peasants. So it was massively popular. People said, yeah, I prefer this than the provisional government. Lenin also convinced all 12 leading members of the Bolsheviks to revolt. Now to do this, he really had to use his persuasive skills, because two leading members, Kamenev and Zinoviev, did not want to revolt, yet he convinced them now was the time. He didn't want to wait, you see, until an election was planned later in the year, because he thought that any election might not lead to a Bolshevik victory. So that was quite cunning. Trotsky also was key, but in a different way. He wasn't the speaker of the revolution, he wasn't the motivator, he was instead the organiser. Because as chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, he was the one that led the Military Revolutionary Committee, and he was the one that made sure that pretty much all the soldiers in Petrograd were in control of the MRC by the launch of the revolution. So here's that question, just put in a different way as a revision card, which you'll get access to. And once again, to get this into your head, I would potentially, you could always read the revision guide, that's on page 17 and 18 of the revision guide, but I would sit down with this and see if you can trace the different parts of it and tell the story or the reasons for the Bolshevik Revolution, and then turn the page over and copy down all your icons and annotations from memory, then check to see which ones you've forgotten, and then try to tell the reasons for the Bolshevik Revolution completely from memory. So just in your head, picture what you've drawn and picture your annotations and just talk it through. You could do this to someone, like tell one of your parents or your siblings or a friend about it, but really you could just do it in your own head out loud to yourself to see what you can remember, and it really embeds it into your memory.